This is part 3 of my talk, and this part is to do with therapies, both those which are used and those which might be used and those which shouldn't be used. So you may remember at the end of part 1, I made a rather abrasive remark that misquoting Churchill, and said that never in the history of science was so much money spent by so many people to achieve such a small result. Well, that was a bit unfair to Cancer Research UK, because I do notice that of the 164 million net that they spent on research, they've got it in the right order. You know, the 19 million on lungs, 19 million on colorectal, 18 million on breast cancer research, 16 million on leukemia, and 12 on brain. So they're more or less following the same pattern as the kind of numbers of people which are getting those disorders. Anyways, the new chief executive was quite proud of herself in the annual report. She featured a cohort study which has been going on for some years on cervical cancer in women. And they reported on a new study which had compared giving chemotherapy before giving X-ray against just giving X-ray and accompanying it at the same time with the chemo. And she was very pleased that the results seemed to indicate that this was a good way of treating cervical cancer. But what she didn't mention was that the side effects on both methods were very bad and worse when you give the chemo separately from the radiotherapy. She also didn't mention that the improvement was more or less the same, a little bit, not a great deal better when you use chemotherapy. And also when I looked at the authors of the study, I couldn't help but comment that so many of them seem to have affiliations with the pharmaceuticals industry, which they declared, quite honestly. But I do believe that they could have been using better treatments than just chemo before radiotherapy. And as an example of that, I would like to talk about the use of melatonin as an adjuvant for cancers. There is a great deal of evidence that melatonin helps people with cancer and reduces the side effects, the symptoms. It's completely safe. In fact, arguably it's safest biomolecule on the planet. And it's very effective, of course, in other ways. It's a very powerful antioxidant. It protects the fetus in the womb. But there are quite a few studies now, I don't know how many exactly, but I think it's in the 20s, which show that when you use melatonin as well as the conventional 3 interventions, you do get a better result. But in vain, I looked through Cancer Research's website, and I couldn't anywhere find any mention of melatonin except for one small sentence which says it helps you get a better night's sleep. But doesn't look as if they've ever done any studies on melatonin in conjunction with existing therapies. And time and time again, the studies which I did read on melatonin showed and concluded that it was really well worth carrying out further research on that particular indole. Anyway, maybe Cancer Research UK was influenced by a report which was produced by the government in 2006 on melatonin and cancer by one of the committees that the government set up. And they were very lukewarm about it. They said, well, you know, it's not really worth following up on. But when I looked down through the references in that report, I discovered that they had omitted every single paper produced by probably the world's most important researcher on melatonin, and it happens to be a friend of mine, Russ Reiter, who has written 300 papers or more on melatonin, and is arguably the most respected researcher in that field in the world. And they didn't even mention him in the government report of 2006. So my inclination is that I really don't pay much attention to their weak conclusions about melatonin. It's very important that we conduct research into melatonin and see just how much it can help cancer patients. And I'll talk about them a little bit later. And I would be interested to see if in the future Cancer Research UK does actually start looking at that particular area of cancer cure. And I wouldn't say it cures. I don't think melatonin will cure cancer, but I think as an adjuvant it's a pretty powerful hormone. At this point I'd like to talk a bit about the 1939 Cancer Act in the United Kingdom, because it throws some light on why present therapies are more or less restricted to surgery, chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Now that act was set out in 1939 on the verge of the Second World War, and before there was any television, and certainly before there was any internet, which promotes and disseminates information to the general public. And it was designed because there were a lot of quack treatments being offered around that time. And the original purpose of the bill and the act was to restrict those or prevent those. But in doing so, it gave rise to far more emphasis on the three major interventions which we see today. Most of that act has now been repealed, but Section 4 still remains, and that enables and empowers trading standards and units to bring prosecutions wherever they feel it's necessary. And in fact, I was part of one in Isleworth Crown Court, where I was an expert witness on behalf of Mrs. Elizabeth Marsh, who got 6 months for publishing a pamphlet which invited people with AIDS to test out a cancer therapy. I think that my evidence was disallowed by the judge on the basis that the jury wouldn't understand it, which was not true, because I'd written it in a very popular style and not at all too technically for them. But anyway, there are some reasons why the 1939 Cancer Act needs total revision or complete renewal in a different sense, now that we have completely different modes of public awareness. And it's not the law which is controlling exposures and coax, it's the social media. It's the television companies can choose whether or not to discuss an issue. they can stop it or start it. The internet providers, like, they can delete any videos or information that they choose. So we need to re-look at that area. Anyway, I think there are better therapies than the three major ones. And I'd like to point to melatonin as one of those. Now, I'm not promoting any particular product. I want to make it quite clear that my talk is aimed towards information and to the medical professionals, and not promoting any particular product or service, because I don't want to be branded as having contravened the 1939 Cancer Act. But I would like to talk about melatonin. And I'd said in another part of this talk, I put up 4 studies. I ended up putting over 200 studies on melatonin and cancer, which really are enormous levels of evidence that we should be looking at this in relation to cancer, looking at melatonin in relation to cancer. I know that Thomas Seyfried has been talking a lot about cancer as a metabolic disorder, and he's right. And he also mentions Warburg. I notice he doesn't mention Szent-Györgyi, who had the same opinion. But he doesn't really, although he understands the oxidative phosphorylation change towards glycolysis, and that by limiting sugar intake you are starving the cancer cells. Yes, that's probably true. But he also says it won't cure cancer, it'll just bring down the level of tumours and so on to a point where they're more easily treated by conventional therapies. But he doesn't mention the rest of the story. For example, William Koch not only recognized all that and laid out the biochemistry of it, but he also discovered the aberrant cells, the cancer cells, can be brought back to normal. And I think that philosophy is superior to the present one, that the objective is to kill the cancer cells. He didn't kill the cancer cells, he just got them back to normal OXPHOS pathways. And that is a much better approach to dealing with cancer, in my opinion, than the present one of what some people call cut, poison and burn. I think it's important then that I do explain something about how Koch's product, how his therapies work, because he's been accused of so many things. The first one he's been accused of is that he was only offering pure water. Well, the court cases against him by the FDA in 1943 and 1946 were only a few years, if that, after the first invention of spectrophotometry. So it's unlikely that anyone at that time looking at a high dilution could detect the fact that even with what homeopathists call 6x dilution, which is taking the chemical, or whatever it is you're diluting, and then putting into a water solution, then taking 1/10 of that and doing it again 6 times till you get to a very high dilution. Even in that high dilution, there are thousands of molecules of that chemical. And that is what Koch aimed to do. He didn't want masses of that chemical, in this case parabenzoquinone, to be around, because it works better if it's got the freedom to do its job. So by that high dilution, William Koch was able to change the glycolysis pathway back to the OXPHOS pathway. And let me explain this. Normally, the creation of energy for us and in our bodies is in the mitochondria, in its inner matrix. And what it does is it separates hydrogen atoms so that the positively charged hydrogen proton is one side of the membrane and the negatively charged electron is on the other side, and that's the procedure with what's called electron transport. And how it does that is it uses a quinone, a CoQ10. We've all heard of CoQ10, you can get it in pharmacies, but the Q stands for quinone. And that actually acts as a free radical. And if there's anything in the way blocking the cytochromes at all, it has the electronegativity to pull them out and put the electron in. Well, that's okay, but the modern carcinogens are too powerful, and CoQ10 can't do that. And what Koch did was to discover that parabenzoquinone is more electronegative and has greater pulling power, if you like. Para means that both of the oxygens are on the same side of the molecule. And that extra electronegativity helps to pull any carcinogens out of their binding sites on the cytochromes. Well, in doing it, it does the same thing that the CoQ10 does. It turns itself briefly into a free radical to do that job. And that's how you get the quinones out. If you can deliver a lot of oxygen at the same time, he says keep a very good oxygen level there in the patient or around the patient. If you can do that, then the pathway comes back, the mitochondria go back to normal, and the first thing they do is to rebuild their glycoproteins. Now, because of glycolysis, you'll find that every cancer cell hasn't got a glycocalyx, hasn't got glycoproteins on the surface, because the cell has resorbed them in order to satisfy the glycolysis. And whereas the OXPHOS pathway can create 35 net ATP molecules from one glucose molecule, glycolysis can only create 12 molecules of ATP from one glucose molecule. So, as Lewis Thomas said, if you think like a cell, your situation is that you're desperate for glucose because you're only making 12 molecules under glycolysis. And that's not enough to keep you going, because you need to find that kind of number of molecules, to ATP molecules, to power what's called the sodium-potassium pump, which keeps the cell viable. So the cell says, look, either I have to get 3 times as much sugar from somewhere to support glycolysis, or I have to nearly die and be unable to do my job. So that's what happens. That's what's happening inside the cell. And so what it does is first it takes off all the sugar it can find, the nearest sources, which are all around its glycoproteins, and that actually blinds it. It can't hear anything, it can't see anything anymore. It doesn't need the oxygen because glycolysis doesn't use it, it's anaerobic. And so you see these 3 trends in every cancer cell. First, they're not interested in oxygen uptake. Secondly, they don't avoid contact inhibition, so because they don't know anything about outside world. And that actually blinds it. It can't hear anything, it can't see anything anymore. And thirdly, they don't have any glycoproteins on their membrane surface. And that is why those characteristics are there. Anyway, so what the cells then do, of course, is to go looking for glucose. And that's why they invade other epithelial tissue. It's to find the glucose. Angiogenesis is to build pathways to glucose so that the glucose can come into the
growing tumour. And it'll carry on doing that because it can't do anything else. If you, instead of trying to kill that, you try to get it back to OXPHOS, then you have a better chance of success, because surgery, whatever you say, always leaves a few cancer cells somewhere in the body, which then start to do the expansion, growth, tumor growth again. You get secondaries. Chemotherapy does the same. It doesn't solve the problem. It certainly harms the patient, but it doesn't really solve the problem. And radiotherapy, by killing perfectly good cells, starts creating free radicals of its own, and that again is not conducive to good health. So the essence of Koch's idea was that he didn't try and kill the cancer cells, he tried to get them to come back to normal. And then what happens is quite interesting, because at the end of that process, and I'll show you the chemistry of it, what happens is that the cells are ending up with one free radical, and that goes on to the next cancer cell and turns that back to OXPHOS. So it's a kind of chain reaction and goes all around the body until you've got no cancer cells anywhere in the body. That is what Koch achieved. Radiotherapy and chemotherapy, they work to some extent, but they don't work fully, because there are going to be secondaries, they're going to be recurrences, and that's why the 10-year survival rate is always much lower than the 5-year survival rate. It's because of secondaries. So we need to rethink the philosophy of how we treat cancer. Anyway, I think I've said enough about that. I will put some more of the biochemistry in this video. Anyway, going on from there, there are other therapies as well which could be used and aren't, and like antiparasitic drugs, Fenben, and so on. There are quite a few of those. They should be explored. Now, I'd like at this point to thank Stephen Barrett from Quackwatch. Although he to some extent throws the baby out with the bathwater, and he condemns some therapies which might have some currency, Quackwatch is an important and useful source of all the articles which have gone on in the past and present, which enable one to get a much more balanced judgment. And I used Quackwatch quite extensively to learn about events which had taken place in the very early part of the 20th century. And I'm grateful to Stephen Barrett, who's now 92, by the way, for that. So we know that the two trials on Koch both failed, and what happened in there was that he had about 40 people who came in and said his therapy didn't work, but he had over 100 people who came in and said yes, it did work, and they'd been cured. And as for Koch himself, he always followed up his patients' life right to the end of their life. He didn't just stop at 10 years, and he was able to say, in many cases that he chronicles, that his patients had lived for 15 or 20 years and died of something else than cancer. So it's very important that we get to know that. There's another area of research that isn't being done, and that is the importance of the alternative current electric field in impacting on our ability to create energy, ATP. I mentioned that the electrons are on one side of the matrix and the hydrogen protons are on the other, and how ATP is created is that it's like a battery, really. You've got a positive and a negative separated, and when you join them, you get a flow of energy, and that energy binds a third phosphate to ADP, and that ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is what gives us the energy to go around and to live. That's where we get our life energy from. But the scientists will agree that at power frequencies, at the frequencies we use in our homes, there's no relationship between the magnetic and the electric field, because they're both in what we call the radiating near field. And that means that any research you do on the magnetic field can say nothing about the electric field. And what electric fields are crowds of electrons. So, and if you put crowds of electrons into mitochondria, it's going to depolarize that battery and stop the creation of ATP. And that's what happens. The American Cancer Society, quite inaccurately, completely inaccurately, say that there's no evidence that the electric field does any harm, the AC electric field. But that's untrue. We published in the peer-reviewed literature a study of childhood leukemia where we showed that if the child is sleeping in an electric field anywhere above 20 volts per meter, that child is at 5-fold risk of leukemia. We did that, it was published, and the statistics we produced were analysed by the Welsh cancer statistician. And that is good evidence that the electric field has an adverse effect. And the government did a study, and they also found that anywhere near a power line, children are far more likely to get leukemia, far more likely being two times. But they only, they said they didn't know why this was happening, and they couldn't relate it to the magnetic field. When they tried to do an electric field study, I noticed that Sir Richard Doll, who was involved in that, diluted the results so that they used 48-hour exposures, measurements. Of course, the child isn't in bed 48 hours. It's only in bed in 8-hour periods. And I said to him in the public meeting, well, your study is flawed, but you could change it by just taking the measurements when the child was actually in the bedroom. He couldn't answer that question, to be honest. But that's the situation. The electric field is what we need to watch. And in any home in any developed country, somewhere in that home there is going to be a high electric field, well above 20 volts per meter. I think the clearest, and it can get into the water system. I would like to talk about one example. Eddie O'Gorman, who lost both two members of his family, at least, to cancer, asked me to come and look at his home because he had a feeling that there was something to do with the electric fields in it, or electromagnetic fields in it. And when I went to his rather nice home, which had been built by an architect, I noticed that what the architect had done was to put both the water system and the electrical supply in the same cupboard, very close to each other. And the effect of that was that in his water system all around the house, the electric field was in the 90 volts per meter region. And that is why his family got so affected. And when I said, look, if you move the water system and the electricity supply at least a meter away from each other, then you will solve that problem, which I think he did. And that is what I found in many homes during my measurements of cancer patients, and in measurements of infants who had died of cot death. Same thing, that the electric field was damaging the infant's ability to send signals to his cells. And what then happened was that the fibers in the corpus callosum were melting because of the brain's attempts to up its intensity to deal with that exposure, and failed, and the infants died as a result. And a professor in, I think it was Newcastle, did a study of the infant death brains, and he found the same thing. He found that the fibers of the corpus callosum had melted and recoagulated in the third and lateral ventricles, and that is another big finding. And when I put that out on the media, a long time ago it was, when I put it out on the media, the next year cot deaths in the United Kingdom fell by 2/3. They were only a third of the level, because mums didn't know whether we were right or anyone else was right. So they decided that they would take no chances and take the kids away from electric fields which they could see. Well, they could see the appliances, I put it that way. And often I would find the field strength in the cot death case locations was well over 20 volts per meter. And the infants would struggle to get to the other end of the cot from the exposure source. And another phenomenon of cot death is that when the mum would see the baby looking pale and ill, she would take it out of the cot, run to the doctor, and by the time she got to the doctor and it was out of the electric field, it had got back to normal. So there's quite a lot of evidence that the electric field is an issue which needs to be looked at from the point of view of cancer therapies. And if you could persuade the public to make sure they didn't sleep in an electric field, I'm sure it would have a beneficial effect on cancer. Anyway, I've said enough about that.
Earlier I talked about power frequency effects on the human body, and particularly on children. But I really ought to also mention that the same dangers or risks apply with the higher frequencies, and have been noted ever since the 1950s, when the American embassy in Moscow, which was being irradiated by the Soviets at the time to pick up bug signals, found that their staff had the highest incidence of cancer in the world. And then they discovered that the embassy was being irradiated. And ever since then, there's been a huge controversy about the effects of non-ionizing but high-frequency radiation on the human body. And as a result of that, many different studies have been carried out. And I mention a few of them here. But the controversy has been intense, and pioneers like Ross Adey and Martin Blank, both friends of mine. Martin was at Columbia University, and Ross Adey was at the Veterans Administration in Loma Linda. And they both pointed to the problem of the electric field, and that actually also applies at high frequencies. In fact, as the frequency increases, the percentage of energy in the electric field also increases. So, if anything, the effect should be more pronounced, even at much lower power densities. Anyway, that's the problem. And I wanted to bring it to the public attention in the late 90s. And so in 1998, I brought an action in the courts against a local mobile phone supplier, saying that because there was a potential risk to health, his phone should all carry a warning label to say so. Just as you know, heaters do. They say don't put a towel on this heater, and it's a statute of the 1976 Consumer Protection Act, and that's the act I chose to bring this suit? Well, the magistrate found that the defendant not guilty because he said he actually tried to research the issue, but the owner of the shop where I took the action said that he told me that when he agreed with me that there was a risk, but when he asked his suppliers if he could put a label on the phones to say so, they all said if he did that, they would refuse to supply him. So that's how he got into the courtroom. Well, the courtroom was a 2-day affair and attracted publicity all around the world. That's first and last time I think I've ever been mentioned in the Malaysian Straits Gazette, but it was also mentioned on BBC News and The Independent. Both of them carried the story. And the issue is still there, because although even IARC, the World Health Organization, admits there could be a problem, no new guidelines have been issued, and we're still using what are called SAR, specific absorption rates, which were set up decades ago. But we need to look at that. I think that it's an area which cancer research institutions ought to take on board and see if we can't get a better answer to that situation. Because although the cell phone companies have stalwartly tried to reduce exposures to the human head from the use of a cell phone next to it, in fact, there's quite a few patents been taken out specifically to avoid risks to health. We still haven't resolved the problem, and I think it's something that we really have to look at. And since the cancer industry funding money is there to do it, well, we should use some of that money to take a close look at whether we haven't fallen into the trap of that befell as a Greek scholar, I can tell you this story, befell Philoctetes. And the legend of Philoctetes was that he was an archer who had helped one of the gods by shooting his assailant. And the god said, "Okay, Philoctetes, what do you want?" And he said, "I want a bow that never misses its mark." So the god said, "Okay, you've got that." But he said, "I'm going to bring you a secondary restriction that you will always have a wound. The wound will never heal." And that's what happened to Philoctetes. And he was the only guy who could accurately shoot Achilles in the heel. No one else could manage that feat. But I think we may have the same issue with mobile phones.
There are lots of other interventions, and some which have been ridiculed but really should be re-examined. I think the whole light trial therapy needs re-examination. There's one of the videos on YouTube talks about a doctor who worked for I think it was one of the big hospital institutions, and he did some trials on light trial with mice and found it reduced their tumours. But that discovery was overwhelmed and suppressed by others, so that light trial is not supported by the FDA. They don't say it does any harm, but they say it doesn't do any good. Well, that may not be the case. There may be something to look at.
Apart from those I've mentioned, there are other interventions which should be examined, but I leave you to, and the people who are doing the work, to look into those and investigate them. And meanwhile, I would like to give my condolences to King Charles, Princess
of Wales, to some celebrities like Steve Hoy, all of whom have cancer problems, and also to the, I think it's 160,000 people who will die of cancer this year because we are not following the right path towards cure. It's a basic change in philosophy which is needed. I know that doctors follow the Hippocratic Oath, which has 4 sections, but you know, first do no harm. It's not in those sections. It comes from a different paper by Hippocrates, and the mistranslation by people, first do no harm, that's also wrong. What Hippocrates actually said in his treatise on epidemics, not in the Hippocratic Oath, was this. He says, as to diseases, make a habit of but 2 things. First, help the patient, or at least do no harm to the patient. And that's what he actually said. Well, in my opinion, surgery does harm to the patient, cutting him open. Radio and chemotherapy do harm to the patient because they destroy the good cells at the same time as they're destroying the bad ones. And to kill the cancer cells is the wrong approach, in my view, that we should be following the idea put forward by Koch, by Warburg, and by Szent-Györgyi, and others, I suspect, that it's better to get the cell to go back to being normal in its oxidative phosphorylation pathway than to kill it, because you're never going to kill all of them, and sooner or later they'll come back. That's why, you know, the 5-year and the 10-year survival figures always show a decreasing percentage or a decreasing number, because there are always going to be secondaries. We've got to get rid of that idea. Anyway, that's my opinion about the way cancer research is being conducted today, both in America and in UK and Europe.